October 1974. San Fernando Valley, California. The room smelled like money. Not the kind earned through hard work. The kind people gambled with. The kind people lost. The kind people made by convincing others to risk everything. 600 people packed into a converted warehouse on the edge of the valley. The building had once stored machine parts. Now it held something far more dangerous. Human pride. Rows of folding chairs stretched from one wall to the other. Cigarette smoke floated beneath hot television lights. Bookmakers whispered. Promoters grinned. Reporters sharpened pencils. And everyone had come for the same reason. To watch another man fail. At the center of the warehouse stood a boxing ring surrounded by spotlights. Inside that ring waited the most terrifying attraction in California. His name was Roy Calhoun. And Roy Calhoun did not look human. At least not in the way people usually meant it. He stood 6'4". He weighed 612 pounds. His shoulders looked wide enough to block a doorway. His hands resembled shovels. His neck was so thick his head seemed attached directly to his torso. Everything about him suggested one simple truth. If he touched you, you were finished. For 14 months Roy had been undefeated. Not in boxing. Not in wrestling. Not in karate. Something stranger. Something more humiliating. A challenge. A public challenge. Survive 12 seconds with Roy Calhoun. That was all. No knockout required. No submission required. No victory required. Just survive. 12 seconds. And if you did, you earned $100,000. In 1974, $100,000 could change a life. Buy a house. Start a business. Support a family for years. Which explained why so many men tried. And why so many failed. 18 challengers had entered Roy's ring. 18 challengers had lost. National wrestlers. Judo black belts. Boxers. Karate instructors. Kickboxers. Men who had spent their lives fighting. None lasted 12 seconds. Most didn't make 8. One former wrestling champion survived 7 seconds before Roy simply lifted him off the canvas like luggage and dropped him. The crowd loved it. The crowd always loved it. Watching impossible strength destroy confidence never got old. Especially when it wasn't happening to them. The mastermind behind the spectacle was Gerald Webb. A promoter with expensive suits and a cheap soul. Webb understood something about people. People loved heroes. But they loved watching heroes fail even more. For months, he had been growing increasingly irritated by a particular martial artist. A man who appeared in magazines. A man appearing on television. A man teaching that speed, technique and timing could overcome size. A man whose popularity kept growing. His name was Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris was 34 years old. A multiple-time world karate champion. A Tang Soo Do master. One of the most respected martial artists in America. Students traveled across states to train under him. Tournament champions studied his techniques. Magazine covers carried his photograph. And everywhere Chuck went, people repeated the same idea. Technique beats strength. Timing beats size. Skill beats power. Gerald Webb hated that idea. Because Roy Calhoun represented the opposite. Roy represented reality. Or at least what Gerald Webb believed reality was. 600 and 12 pounds of reality. 3 weeks before the event, Gerald Webb made his move. Advertisements appeared in newspapers across California. The challenge was simple. The language was carefully chosen. The target obvious. It never mentioned Chuck Norris by name. It didn't need to. Anyone reading it knew exactly who Webb wanted. The advertisement mocked the idea that martial arts could overcome overwhelming size. It invited any famous karate instructor to prove otherwise. The challenge carried $100,000 and a public stage. The entire martial arts community noticed immediately. So did Chuck Norris. The newspaper arrived at Chuck's karate school on a Tuesday morning. One of his students brought it over. "Have you seen this?" Chuck glanced at the page, then read it again. Then once more. The room grew quiet. Students stopped practicing. Everyone watched, because they knew exactly what the advertisement meant, and who it was aimed at. For nearly a minute Chuck said nothing. He simply studied the page, then folded the newspaper neatly, set it down, and returned to drinking his coffee. The students exchanged nervous glances. Finally, one of them asked, "What do you think?" Chuck looked through the front window. Cars passed outside. People walked along the sidewalk. Life continued normally. Meanwhile, somewhere in San Fernando Valley, a giant was waiting. Chuck smiled slightly, the same small smile that usually appeared right before something interesting happened. Then he said 4 words. "Call him for me." Nobody spoke. One student blinked. Another nearly dropped his coffee. "You're serious?" Chuck looked at him. "Does that sound like a joke?" The room exploded with questions. Why? When? What was the plan? Did he really think he could survive? Was this even safe? Chuck listened patiently, then raised a hand. Silence returned immediately. Finally, he answered. "People keep talking about size." Nobody interrupted. "They keep talking about weight." Still nobody spoke. But nobody's talking about movement. That answer confused everyone, except Chuck. Because while everyone else saw a giant, Chuck saw a problem. And every problem had an answer. 2 weeks later, confirmation arrived. The fight was official. The warehouse sold out in less than 48 hours. Ticket prices tripled. Bookmakers took bets. Sports writers wrote articles. Karate schools argued endlessly. Half the martial arts world thought Chuck was brave. The other half thought he was crazy. Maybe both were right. The night of the challenge arrived. The warehouse overflowed. People stood against walls, sat on equipment crates, crowded every available space. Nobody wanted to miss history. The only question was what kind of history they were about to witness. 20 minutes before the event began, a side door opened. Chuck Norris stepped inside. No entourage. No bodyguards. No students. No cameras. Just Chuck. Dark slacks. Simple collared shirt. Calm expression. Steady eyes. He looked less like a fighter preparing for a challenge, and more like a man arriving to fix a broken machine. Event staff barely noticed him. One employee even asked if he had a ticket. Chuck smiled. "I'm the challenger." The employee laughed, then realized he wasn't joking. Moments later, Gerald Webb arrived. The promoter's smile appeared instantly, because what he saw felt like free money. If Roy crushed Chuck Norris, the story would spread across America. The famous karate champion destroyed. The philosophy disproven. The debate ended forever. Webb extended his hand. Mr. Norris. Chuck shook it. Briefly. Firmly. Then looked past him. Toward the ring. Toward Roy Calhoun. Toward the largest human being he'd ever seen standing inside a fighting ring. For several seconds, neither man looked away. 612 pounds. Against 170 pounds. The size difference felt absurd. Almost impossible. What are the rules? Chuck asked. Webb explained them. 12 seconds. No weapons. No outside interference. Survive 12 seconds and win. Simple. Chuck listened. Then nodded once. And the money. Waiting for whoever earns it. Chuck looked toward Roy again. Then smiled. I'll need some water. As workers hurried away to get it. Roy Calhoun continued watching from across the warehouse. Most challengers looked nervous. Most looked scared. Most tried hiding it. Chuck Norris looked different. Too calm. Too relaxed. Too certain. And for the first time in 14 months, Roy Calhoun felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not yet. But curiosity. Because standing across the warehouse was the first challenger who didn't seem interested in surviving. And that made Roy wonder what he had come to do. The announcer stepped into the ring. The crowd quieted. The lights dimmed. History moved closer. And somewhere inside that crowded warehouse, nobody realized the challenge would be over in less than 5 seconds. The warehouse had gone silent. 600 people. Not one voice. Not one laugh. Not one cough. Everyone was staring at the ring. At one corner stood Roy Calhoun. 612 pounds. A mountain disguised as a man. At the opposite corner stood Chuck Norris. Calm. Relaxed. Almost casual. The contrast looked ridiculous. Like someone had placed a racehorse inside a cage with a bulldozer. And that was exactly why people had bought tickets. Nobody came to watch a fair fight. They came to watch what happened when reality crushed a dream. At least, that's what they thought they were buying. Gerald Webb stood outside the ropes. His expensive suit gleamed beneath the lights. His smile had never been wider. Every ticket sold. Every chair occupied. Every bookmaker busy. The event had already made money. Now all he needed was the ending. Roy wins. Chuck loses. The story spreads. The challenge becomes legendary. Simple. Profitable. Perfect. The announcer raised a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen. The crowd erupted. Cheers. Whistles. Shouts. Then silence returned as quickly as it arrived. The atmosphere felt electric. Dangerous. Like a thunderstorm seconds before lightning. Chuck stood motionless. His eyes weren't focused on Roy. That surprised several reporters. They expected him to stare directly at the giant. Instead, Chuck appeared to be studying everything else. The ropes. The corners. The canvas. The distance. The lighting. The angles. The exits. A reporter scribbled a note. Another noticed the same thing. Neither understood why. Across the ring, Roy noticed it too. And unlike the reporters, he understood. Because serious fighters don't just study opponents. They study environments. The ring itself was information. And Chuck was collecting it. The announcer stepped back. The referee moved to the center. Fighters ready. Roy lowered his chin slightly. Ready. Chuck nodded once. Ready. The referee glanced at both men. Then raised his hand. Begin. Roy exploded forward. The crowd gasped. Every first-time spectator had the same reaction. The same shock. The same disbelief. Because 600 pounds should not move that fast. The laws of nature seemed wrong. His feet hammered the canvas. The ring shook. The distance disappeared instantly. 15 feet. 10 feet. 7 feet. 5 feet. Most challengers froze right here. The brain would see the giant moving. Then spend precious fractions of a second processing the impossible speed. Those fractions were fatal. That was how Roy won. Again and again. And again. Not tonight. Chuck had already moved. Not backward. Not sideways. Not away. Different. The movement was so small most people missed it. Even reporters. Even fighters. Even Roy. At first, one moment Chuck occupied a space. The next moment, that space was empty. Roy's arms closed. Nothing there. For the first time in 14 months. Roy Calhoun grabbed air. The crowd went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Absolute silence. Because nobody understood what they had just seen. Roy took one additional step. A tiny mistake. An invisible mistake. The kind most people would never notice. But Chuck noticed. And Roy noticed. The giant had committed his weight. And found nothing. For the first time all night. The giant was recovering. Not attacking. Recovering. Chuck stood 2 feet away. Perfectly balanced. Perfectly relaxed. Watching. No strike. No attack. No celebration. Just observation. Roy turned. Faster than expected. Much faster. His eyes narrowed. Now he understood something important. This challenger wasn't like the others. The previous 18 men had reacted to Roy. Chuck Norris had anticipated him. There was a difference. A dangerous difference. The crowd still hadn't made a sound. Because something invisible had happened. Something people couldn't fully explain. Yet everyone felt it. The certainty inside the building had cracked. Gerald Webb felt it first. A small cold sensation in his stomach. Nothing dramatic. Just discomfort. The feeling people get when a prediction starts collapsing. He told himself it didn't matter. Roy had missed before. Not often, but occasionally. The outcome never changed. Then Roy adjusted. His stance widened. His knees lowered. His center of gravity dropped. Smarter now. More cautious. The giant wasn't rushing anymore. That worried Chuck far more than the charge. Because reckless opponents are easy. Disciplined opponents are dangerous. Roy slowly began circling. Watching. Thinking. The crowd finally remembered how to breathe. A murmur moved through the warehouse. Small at first. Then louder. Nobody had expected a second phase. Every previous challenge had ended before strategy mattered. Now strategy mattered. Roy moved left. Chuck moved left. Roy moved right. Chuck moved right. Neither attacked. A strange tension spread across the room. People came expecting violence. Instead, they were witnessing a conversation. A silent conversation. Conducted through movement. Balance. Positioning. Timing. Roy suddenly stopped. Then smiled. It wasn't arrogance. Not anymore. Respect. The giant finally understood he was standing across from someone special. Okay. Roy's deep voice echoed through the ring. Just one word. But everyone heard it. Chuck smiled back. Very slightly. For the first time all night. The two men understood each other. And that made what happened next even more unbelievable. Because Roy launched forward again. Vaster. Smarter. More controlled. And this time, he caught Chuck. The giant's hand closed around Chuck Norris's forearm. The warehouse exploded. People jumped from chairs. Bookmakers shouted. Gerald Webb grinned. Reporters scrambled for notebooks. Finally, the giant had him. At least, that's what everyone believed. Except Chuck Norris. Roy Calhoun had him. Or at least that's what 600 people believed. The giant's hand wrapped completely around Chuck Norris's forearm. His fingers locked. His grip tightened. And everyone in the warehouse knew what happened next. Because they'd seen it 18 times before. The pattern never changed. The hand closed. The challenger struggled. Roy pulled. The fight ended. Simple. Predictable. Final. The crowd erupted. People jumped to their feet. Bookmakers started laughing. Several reporters were already writing their headlines. One photographer raised his camera. He wanted the exact moment Chuck Norris disappeared into Roy Calhoun's gravitational field. Because that was what usually happened. Once Roy touched you, the rest was paperwork. Gerald Webb smiled. For the first time all night. A real smile. Not nervous. Not forced. Certain. The giant had finally made contact. And contact meant victory. Across the ring, Chuck Norris remained calm. Completely calm. The expression on his face never changed. Not even slightly. That bothered Roy immediately. Because every challenger reacted. Every single one. Panic. Urgency. Fear. Resistance. Something. Chuck showed none of it. Roy began pulling. And that's when something strange happened. Chuck didn't resist. The crowd expected him to yank backward. Expected him to fight the grip. Expected him to struggle against 600 pounds. Instead, he moved with it. Roy's eyes narrowed. For a split second, the giant felt uncertainty. Not because the movement was powerful. Because it was intelligent. Chuck rotated his arm. A tiny movement. Almost invisible. Most spectators never saw it happen. Yet Roy felt it instantly. His grip changed. Not broken. Changed. The pressure no longer traveled in the direction Roy expected. The angle shifted. The friction shifted. The leverage shifted. And suddenly, something that felt permanent no longer felt permanent. Roy pulled harder. Chuck rotated again. The adjustment lasted less than half a second. But half a second was an eternity tonight. Because while Roy was busy holding, Chuck was busy learning. Learning where the force originated. Learning where the balance lived. Learning where the weakness existed. The giant still had him. Technically. But now Chuck understood something. Roy's grip was strongest in front. Strongest when people fought against it. Strongest when people behaved exactly as he expected. Chuck had no intention of doing that. The crowd sensed something changing. Nobody could explain it. Yet everyone felt it. The atmosphere had shifted again. The certainty was disappearing. Roy felt it too. And for the first time in 14 months, the giant became impatient. That impatience cost him. Because when Roy pulled again, Chuck moved. Not away. Through. A slight turn. A small step. A tiny redirection. Nothing dramatic. Yet somehow, Chuck Norris was no longer trapped. The warehouse exploded. People shouted. Several spectators stood on chairs. One reporter actually dropped his notebook. Because nobody had ever escaped Roy's grip before. Nobody. Not wrestlers. Not black belts. Not professionals. Nobody. Roy stared. The giant looked at his own hand. Then looked at Chuck. Then looked back at his hand. As though it had betrayed him. Chuck stood less than 2 feet away. Completely relaxed. Completely balanced. And now something remarkable happened. Neither man moved. The clock continued running. Second 4. The crowd held its breath. Roy realized something. The fight was no longer physical. Not really. The physical battle ended the moment Chuck escaped. Now they were having a different conversation. A conversation about understanding. About timing. About perception. About reality. The giant finally saw the truth. This wasn't a contest between strength and weakness. It was a contest between certainty and adaptability. And certainty was losing. Roy took one slow step forward. Chuck took one slow step sideways. Again the giant found empty space. Again he arrived where Chuck had already stopped being. The realization hit Roy harder than any punch. He wasn't chasing a man. He was chasing a decision. And Chuck Norris kept making that decision first. The giant suddenly stopped. Completely stopped. The crowd became silent again. Roy looked directly at Chuck. For several long seconds. Then something happened nobody expected. Roy smiled. A real smile. The smile of a man who had finally understood the problem. And finally, at exactly the 5th second, Chuck Norris raised his right hand. Not a punch. Not a strike. Not an attack. An open palm. He gently placed it against the center of Roy Calhoun's chest. And the warehouse froze. 600 people. Absolute silence. Because everyone understood the message. The hand itself wasn't important. What mattered was what it meant. If Chuck could place an open hand there, he could have placed something else there. A strike. A blow. A finish. The giant looked down. At the hand. Then back up. For the first time in 14 months. Roy Calhoun knew he had lost. The warehouse was silent. Not quiet. Silent. 600 people stared at the center of the ring. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe. Chuck Norris stood calmly in front of Roy Calhoun. His open palm rested lightly against the giant's chest. No force. No aggression. No violence. Just contact. Just proof. And somehow that made the moment even more powerful. Because everyone understood exactly what it meant. Roy Calhoun looked down. At the hand. Then back at Chuck. Then down again. The giant's breathing slowed. For the first time that evening. He wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about understanding. 5 seconds. 5 seconds had done what 14 months could not. 5 seconds had answered a question everyone believed was already settled. 5 seconds had broken the strongest argument Gerald Webb had ever built. The giant slowly released his stance. His shoulders relaxed. His hands dropped to his sides. The fight was over. Not because someone had been knocked unconscious. Not because someone had been pinned. Not because someone had surrendered. The fight was over because one man now understood something he hadn't understood before. Roy looked directly at Chuck. 5 seconds. Chuck nodded. 5. Roy shook his head slowly. Almost laughing. Not from embarrassment. From disbelief. The giant looked around the warehouse. At the crowd. At the reporters. At the bookmakers. At Gerald Webb. Then back at Chuck. And finally said the words nobody expected. You win. The room exploded. People jumped from chairs. Some cheered. Some shouted. Some simply stared in disbelief. Reporters began writing furiously. Photographers rushed toward the ring. The noise became deafening. But Gerald Webb wasn't celebrating. Gerald Webb looked sick. Because his argument had just died in public. For 14 months he had sold certainty. Now certainty was gone. The promoter climbed into the ring. His face red. His smile gone. His voice sharp. The challenge wasn't completed. The crowd immediately booed. Webb ignored them. 12 seconds. He pointed toward the clock. It lasted 5. The boos grew louder. Roy looked at him. Then looked at Chuck. Then back at Webb. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Roy asked a question. Did I stop him? Webb hesitated. No. Did I control him? No. Could I catch him? The promoter didn't answer. Because everyone already knew the answer. Roy stepped toward him. Not aggressively, but firmly. The giant's voice became calm. Then the challenge is finished. The crowd erupted again. This time louder. Much louder. Webb realized he had lost. Not just the argument. The room. The audience. The story. Everything. 2 days later, the lawyers confirmed it. The challenge rules contained no language covering what had happened. No clause. No exception. No loophole. The check had to be paid. $100,000. The largest check Chuck Norris had ever received for standing inside a ring. Reporters followed him everywhere afterward. Radio stations wanted interviews. Newspapers wanted statements. Television producers wanted appearances. Everyone asked the same question. What are you going to do with the money? Most expected obvious answers. A house. A car. Investments. something expensive, something impressive. Instead, Chuck shocked everyone. 3 days after receiving the check, the entire amount disappeared. Not into his bank account, into youth sports programs across Southern California, community centers, karate schools, after-school programs, neighborhood projects, places helping kids stay away from gangs and violence. Every dollar gone. When reporters asked why, Chuck simply shrugged. "I didn't need it." The answer became a headline across California. But the story wasn't over. 6 weeks later, something unexpected happened. One Saturday morning, a large figure walked through the doors of Chuck Norris Karate Studios. No reporters, no cameras, no audience, just Roy Calhoun. Several students immediately recognized him. The giant from the challenge. The strongest man in California. The man everyone had been talking about. Roy wasn't there to fight. He wasn't there for revenge. He wasn't there to argue. He simply sat quietly in the back and watched. For 3 hours. He watched classes, watched drills, watched beginners, watched advanced students, watched Chuck teach. The giant barely spoke, but the students noticed something. Roy paid attention differently than most visitors. He wasn't watching techniques. He was watching ideas, watching principles, watching timing, watching movement, watching understanding. When the final class ended, the giant stood, walked toward Chuck, and stopped. For a moment, neither man spoke. The students nearby pretended not to listen, while listening very carefully. Finally, Roy asked, "When did you know?" Chuck smiled. "Knew what?" "That I couldn't catch you." Chuck thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "Before the bell." Roy laughed. A deep laugh. The kind that comes when truth is too obvious to deny. Then he asked one final question. The most important question of all. "How old?" Chuck looked around the training floor. At the students. At the heavy bags. At the wooden boards. At the mirrors. Then back at Roy. And gave the simplest answer possible. "Because I wasn't trying to beat your strength." Roy waited. Chuck continued. "I was trying to understand it." The giant became very quiet. For several seconds. Then he slowly nodded. The same slow nod witnesses would remember years later. The nod of a man who had finally found the answer he came looking for. Roy extended his hand. Chuck shook it. And with that, the challenge truly ended. Years later, people would argue about the details. About the 5 seconds. About the movement. About the challenge. About what really happened. But Roy Calhoun never argued. Whenever someone asked about Chuck Norris, the giant always said the same thing. "He wasn't faster than me." People would look confused. "He wasn't stronger than me." More confusion. Then Roy would smile. He just understood the problem before everybody else did. And every time he said it, the giant sounded less like a defeated opponent, and more like a student who had learned something valuable.